My wife, Kelly, thought I had no clue about her little scheme. She either believed I was too dumb or too naive to pick up on her growing affair with her coworker, Tom. She assumed I'd just turn a blind eye and let her carry on with him. But she was in for a rude awakening. What she didn't know was that my suspicions had been simmering for a while. The signs were all there: late nights at work, a sudden obsession with upgrading her wardrobe, her mood swings, and a noticeable distance when it came to things we used to enjoy together. Every time I tried to bring it up, she brushed it off like nothing was wrong. Kelly always denied anything was happening, pinning it all on my so-called insecurities and jealousy. With my job keeping me busy, I eventually hired a private investigator. I wasn't about to sit around and be left in the dark. From day one of our relationship, and through the 10 years we'd been married, I made it crystal clear that cheating was a line I wouldn't tolerate. So, with a knot in my stomach, I found myself in Jake Sullivan's office, listening to his report. At first, I felt relieved when he told me that Kelly hadn't crossed that line, yet. But that relief vanished the moment he added, "for now." As it turns out, my wife was definitely in an affair, though it hadn't crossed into something physical. But Jake warned me, it was only a matter of time. Kelly and Tom had apparently started calling each other work spouses. I hated that phrase. She had one spouse, and that was me. While some might see it as harmless or cute, to me, it felt like she was already in an emotional affair. Turns out, I wasn't wrong. Jake's report showed that Kelly and Tom had lunch together every single day, just the two of them. They'd sit close, hold hands, and sometimes even share a kiss. I saw photos of it all, and I swear, I wanted to throttle that smug bastard, Tom. On top of the lunches, they were conveniently working late together, even though there was no real reason for it. It was as if they were avoiding their real lives, draining every extra minute they could from the day. Jake also managed to track down Kelly's emails and texts. I knew it was illegal and that I couldn't use it in court if things came to that. Divorce for infidelity is tricky in our state. No-fault divorces are much easier and don't require any evidence. Still, I needed this for my own peace of mind. Sullivan refused to hand over the actual messages or let me see them. He just gave me a rundown of what they said. He assured me that Kelly never spoke badly about me, even when Tom tried to. Kelly wouldn't let him say a word against me. I guess, in some twisted way, that was a small mercy. Their emails and texts confirmed their relationship had gotten personal, though neither of them had said, "I love you." The conversations were intimate, almost drifting into sexting territory. Tom had even sent her pictures of his body, which Kelly happily returned with some topless shots of her own. Thankfully, she hadn't sent anything too explicit, at least not yet. As I sat there, trying to wrap my head around everything, Sullivan dropped the worst news yet. Tom's wife was heading out of town for a few days to visit her mother, and Kelly and Tom were planning to use that time to take things to the next level. The only thing in their way? Me. They weren't sure how they could pull off a night together if I was still around. Since I wasn't planning on leaving town, they had to get creative. One idea was to tell me Kelly was going on a girls' weekend. But Kelly didn't want to risk me finding out by checking in with her friends, so they scrapped that plan. Another thought they had was trying to convince me to leave town. Looking back, I remembered Kelly casually suggesting I take a golf trip with my buddies, an offer I turned down without a second thought. In the end, they chose a bold but straightforward approach: honesty. Tom figured I was already on track to being the kind of guy who would turn a blind eye to my wife's affair just to keep her happy and close. He actually convinced Kelly that sleeping with him would somehow improve our sex life and strengthen our relationship. He told her that all she had to do was lay it out for me, and I'd reluctantly agree to let it happen. Clearly, Tom didn't realize just how strong-willed I am. What really shocked me, though, was that Kelly fell for his manipulative story. She should have known better, known that I'd never stand for this. If she didn't see that, I started to wonder if she wasn't thinking straight. Sullivan told me that was all the intel he had for now, so I took the report and headed home. I asked him to keep an eye on Kelly's messages and update me if anything new came up. By Friday, Sullivan called again with an update. Kelly was planning to meet me after work on Monday. She intended to come clean about her plans for Friday night, a romantic date with Tom, dinner, dancing, and then spending the night together at a hotel. The plan was for her to come back home on Saturday or maybe even Sunday, depending on how things went. Kelly and Tom had even rehearsed her little speech, convincing themselves that I'd just go along with it. They expected me to be upset at first, but Kelly was planning to calm me down, promising it was a one-time thing, even though they both knew that wasn't true. She even suggested we could be intimate afterward, as if I'd be thrilled to take her back after she'd been with Tom. How thoughtful of them, considering my needs like that. With only a couple of days to get ready for this so-called intervention, as they jokingly called it, I was determined to turn the tables. Over the weekend, I spent a lot of time thinking, wondering if my marriage with Kelly was even worth saving. As I worked through my emotions, a plan naturally started to form in my mind. I knew I had to confront this head-on and put an end to it once and for all. In the beginning, when we first got married, Kelly and I were inseparable. We shared everything, our time, our dreams, our lives. She was my best friend and, without a doubt, my best lover. But somewhere along the way, all of that faded. Maybe that's just how things go. Maybe nothing is meant to last forever. I guess I'd always held on to this old-fashioned, idealized notion of marriage, two people sticking together, facing whatever life throws at them as a team. Having gone through failed marriages before Kelly, I couldn't help but wonder if the issue was us or if the whole idea of marriage was flawed. How can anyone expect to keep the same feelings, desires, and interests when life has a way of changing everything around us? In this fast-paced world of social media and instant gratification, maybe marriage, like dinosaurs and DVDs, was becoming a thing of the past. I briefly considered letting Kelly be with Tom, but I quickly threw that idea out. There was no way I was going to let him claim any rights over my wife. I was gearing up for a fight. Then, on Monday, just after lunch, Kelly called. "Hey, Kelly," I said, noting how she hadn't been calling me much during work hours lately. It was something I had started to worry about, and I made a point to ask if everything was okay. She greeted me with a, "Hi, honey," and I couldn't help but wonder if she used that same tone with Tom. Pushing that thought aside, I casually asked if she'd be home on time tonight since she said she had something important to talk about. She confirmed she'd be home around 5:15, and I mentioned that I also had something important to share with her. Her silence on the other end of the line told me she was curious. When she asked what my big news was, I told her I'd rather save it for when we were face to face. I then excused myself, saying I had to wrap up a monthly report, and ended the call. After that, I let my boss know I needed the rest of the day off, and he didn't mind one bit. As I sat at the kitchen table later that evening, my nerves were buzzing, but I kept my cool. The garage door creaked open at 5:27, and although I was a mess of emotions on the inside, I kept my exterior calm. There was a chilled bottle of Sauvignon Blanc waiting, along with 2 glasses. When Kelly walked in, tossing her keys and purse onto the table, I felt a wave of relief. Thankfully, Tom wasn't with her, which would have made things even more complicated. I greeted her with a smile. "Hey, sweetheart," I said warmly, mirroring the affectionate way she'd spoken earlier. I asked if she wanted some time to settle in before we had our talk or if she preferred to get straight to it. My eagerness to dive in caught her off guard. I could tell she wasn't expecting me to be so ready to talk. That was part of my plan, to keep her guessing and make sure I stayed in control of the situation. Kelly admitted she hadn't thought I'd be waiting like this, but after a moment's hesitation, she agreed it would be best to get it over with. She sat down at the table with me. I suggested that I share my news first, asking if she had any issues with that. She seemed unsure but gave a hesitant nod, saying it was fine. Without waiting for more of a response, I poured us both a glass of wine. She took it and downed half of hers before I refilled it. I started by telling her that I'd been doing a lot of thinking. I promised I wouldn't drag things out. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy between us, watching as she leaned in, her eyes locked on me. Curious, Kelly asked, "What's going on?" "I want a divorce," I said, laying it out there with no sugarcoating. I let the words sink in, giving her a moment to process. At first, she looked confused, like she couldn't quite understand what I'd just said. But then it hit her, and the shock spread across her face. I saw the flicker of fear, maybe even panic, before it shifted to surprise, probably because she was worried I knew about her and Tom. When she asked why, I told her straight up that my feelings had changed. "I don't love you anymore," I said. That one seemed to hit her hard. She stared at me, stunned, trying to grasp what I was saying. "You, what?" she stammered. "I've fallen out of love with you, Kelly," I said, pretending I didn't remember when it happened. The truth was, I knew exactly when things started to shift, but I'd just been avoiding it. Confused, she asked, "What are you talking about?" She looked like she was on the verge of breaking down, and that surprised me more than I expected. I tried to paint a picture of how things used to be between us, bringing up memories of the early days of our marriage. I reminded her of how we used to spend so much time together, sharing everything. She nodded as I spoke, her eyes showing she was caught up in the memories too. I talked about how we'd have lunch together, how we'd look forward to coming home to one another, and even the pottery classes she convinced me to take with her. I could see how much those moments meant to her as I spoke. "It was never about the pottery," I said, "it was about spending time with you." She told me she loved every minute of those moments, watching me, helping me, enjoying my enthusiasm for it. And she reminded me of how we'd spend hours painting those Christmas village houses we bought one year. We bought a dozen unpainted ones and worked on them together, creating a whole little holiday scene. It was tedious, but we found joy in it. Kelly even admitted that my houses always turned out better than hers, smiling as she remembered those late nights at the table, painting the tiny shingles. Back then, I really did love her. And then there were those giant posters we worked on together, the ones you picked up on our trip to Myrtle Beach, long before adult coloring books were even a thing. We spent hours on those, using all those coloring pens. But now, just like our love, those pens have dried up. Kelly tried to defend herself, saying her love hadn't faded, but I ignored her and kept going. Our friends used to tell us how jealous they were of our relationship. We did everything together. We'd go on long walks every day, always holding hands. If I had to run some errands, like picking up grass trimmer line from the hardware store, you'd tag along with me. And if you wanted to shop for clothes, I'd patiently wait outside the dressing room while you tried things on. Kelly challenged me at that point, reminding me how I didn't exactly love going shopping with her. I explained that even if I was glued to my phone during those trips, I was still there with her. "I didn't really care what you bought," I said. "To me, you looked amazing in everything." I told her how I could have easily stayed home, watching sports, but I chose to be with her instead. We also talked about how other women in the neighborhood would get together for things like bingo or bachelorette parties, but Kelly never seemed interested. "I'd rather hang out with you than the hens," she said, using her old nickname for them. Thinking back on it, we recalled all those nights we'd spend curled up under the blankets, watching our favorite movie. Kelly, brushing away a tear, admitted how much she loved that film. "We must have watched it 100 times, I said, "and I was always happy to keep watching it with you." When I brought up the idea of divorce, Kelly quickly insisted she didn't want the marriage to end. She had pictured us growing old together, taking cooking classes, learning to ballroom dance, or even just lying in bed, reading side by side. I admitted to her that I wasn't exactly sure when things started to change between us, but I could feel the growing distance. Looking her straight in the eye, I reminded her how we used to eat out 2 or 3 times a week, but then it dwindled to once a week, mostly because of her. She had told me she didn't have time for lunch outside the office, but I knew that wasn't true. She was still having lunch, just with someone else. At some point, we stopped going to lunch together altogether, and I found myself joining my coworkers instead. I actually started to enjoy their company, maybe a little more than I should have, I said, stretching the truth a bit. I was careful not to make Kelly feel like she was entirely to blame. I didn't want her to get defensive or for this conversation to turn into an argument. That wasn't what I was going for, not yet. The days of us coming home early just to spend extra time together had lost their meaning. Both of us started staying late at work, and when we finally did get home, we felt miles apart, either distracted or too tired to care. Kelly asked why I never brought it up, and I admitted that she had a point, though, in reality, I had tried more than once to talk about it before. I agreed with her, saying that I wished I could understand why spending time together hadn't seemed important to her anymore. I admitted that I'd often felt like I was the one failing, like I was responsible for the distance between us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I also knew that if I jumped right into confronting her about Tom, we wouldn't get through this without things blowing up. She'd see me as nothing but the jealous, over-controlling husband. I needed her to remember what we had first, to think about how she'd played a part in tearing it down. Slowly, we just stopped doing things together, I continued. You started going to bachelorette parties, and I started spending my evenings at poker nights. You'd go off to the spa on the weekends, and I'd head to the golf course. Kelly and I got to the point where we could go entire days without talking about anything beyond the weather or whatever was on the news. Even our love life had taken a nosedive. Whether it was being too tired or just not feeling it, there was always something getting in the way of our intimacy. I reminded her of how things used to be in the beginning of our marriage, back when we couldn't get enough of each other. Remember how we used to be together 4 or 5 times a week, sometimes more than once a day? I said with a grin. I reminisced about how I'd tease her while she was cooking, and we'd end up skipping dinner altogether, spending the night tangled up in each other. Things like soaking in the hot tub, which used to be part of our regular routine, hadn't happened in over a year. When Kelly hinted that I wasn't interested in being intimate anymore, I shut that down quickly, finding it absurd. It felt like she was trying to shift the blame onto me to justify her own actions. Laughing, I clarified, "Oh no, that's not it at all. I never stopped wanting intimacy. I'm just as eager now as I was 10 years ago. The truth is, I stopped wanting intimacy with you." I knew that would cut deep. She thought she had been rejecting me, but here I was, flipping the script, telling her that the lack of closeness was because I didn't desire her. Kelly, clearly stunned, asked what I meant by saying she didn't want to be intimate with me. Casually, I explained that from where I was standing, she seemed indifferent, uninterested in anything remotely fun or spontaneous. It felt like you just wanted to get it over with and move on to more interesting things, like knitting, I joked, though the sting in my words was intentional. I went on to say how I'd been craving those lazy weekend marathons of intimacy, but she didn't seem to care anymore, not even about experiencing real pleasure. I started labeling our encounters as dull, and honestly, I was just faking enjoyment during the last few times to get it over with, I confessed. Kelly objected, saying I couldn't have been faking since I'd, well, finished. I reminded her how she insisted on using protection even though she was on birth control. I pointed out how she never actually checked, so it was easy for me to fake it, just hum a bit, roll off, and toss the empty condom away. The look on her face was pure shock and humiliation. I admitted my plan had worked and apologized, though my tone wasn't exactly heartfelt. To twist the knife a bit more, I added, "It wasn't you. It was me." She stared at me, her face flushed, tears dry now. I couldn't tell if she was angry, embarrassed, or just plain frustrated. Trying to ease the tension, I refilled her wine glass, and she gulped down another big sip. I continued, telling her it was only a matter of time before one of us started looking for attention elsewhere. When I said, someone else, I wasn't talking about myself, but you didn't know that, I said, throwing her off guard. Suddenly, Kelly's temper flared, and she demanded to know if I was cheating or if I'd fallen for someone else. I reassured her, telling her I was committed to our marriage and had no tolerance for infidelity. I reminded her of how both of us had been cheated on by our exes and how I vowed never to repeat that mistake. Kelly quickly apologized, realizing how unfair the accusation was. She admitted she knew deep down I wasn't capable of doing that, though guilt was written all over her face, her hands trembling slightly. Shifting the conversation, I threw in a bombshell. I told her we should wait until after the divorce before either of us started anything new, hinting at a possible new love in my life. Then, I finally revealed the big news: I had already met with my lawyer and finalized the divorce papers. "You're going to be served with divorce papers this Friday," I informed her. When she frantically asked if I was serious, I calmly confirmed it. I couldn't help but suppress a smile as I explained that it was the best thing for both of us, giving us the freedom to move on. I added that the past 10 years had been a waste of time. She argued, saying those years hadn't been a waste for her. I suggested to Kelly that deep down, she probably wanted the divorce just as much as I did. "It's pretty obvious you haven't wanted to be with me for a long time," I said. I even went as far as calling our marriage a mistake. Kelly immediately objected, insisting she didn't want a divorce and that she still loved me, that she wanted us to stay married forever. With a heavy heart, I told her the truth: I didn't love her anymore. I explained that since we were in a no-fault divorce state, we could split everything evenly without dragging ourselves through a messy legal battle unless one of us could prove the other had cheated, which wasn't likely in our case. I proposed that we divide our finances equally and planned to go to the bank the next day. I mentioned we'd need to open new accounts, get new credit cards, transfer utilities, and put the house up for sale. I told her a realtor was scheduled to come by Wednesday to list it on the market. Kelly, feeling completely overwhelmed, tried to object, her voice shaky as she asked me to stop. Tears welled up again as I calmly told her that I'd already packed my things and would be staying in a hotel until I figured out something more permanent. "I suggest you stay in the house until it sells," I added. She yelled for me to wait, but I pressed on, saying there was no reason to drag this out, stressing that we needed to get everything sorted before Friday. Still confused, she demanded to know what made Friday so important. I casually mentioned that Friday was the night she had planned a date with Tom, her boyfriend. I told her that was the night they were planning to spend together at a hotel, indulging in what she probably thought would be a romantic evening. Kelly froze, her eyes wide, her mouth hanging open as she struggled to respond. I pulled out a folder with the private investigator's summary report and laid it in front of her. I flipped to the part that detailed her plans with Tom for Friday night. As she tried to speak, I cut her off and, with a smirk, said, "Let me guess, it's not what it looks like." I reminded her of the pictures of her and Tom kissing at lunch. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face, mumbling a quiet apology. Grinning, I said, "Funny, because now I remember exactly when I stopped loving you." I told her it was the day I discovered she was setting me up to play the role of the clueless, betrayed husband, much like what had happened with my ex-wife. She stammered out another apology, desperately trying to convince me that she didn't love Tom. According to her, the whole thing was just a fling to spice up our relationship. She went on to claim that after her night with Tom, we would spend the rest of the weekend rekindling our passion. Apparently, Tom had convinced her that this little rendezvous would somehow turn me on and reignite the spark between us. I responded with pure disbelief, telling her I couldn't wrap my head around how sleeping with someone else was supposed to revive our intimacy. I asked how she thought that made any sense. She shifted gears, trying to defend herself by saying that Tom had assured her I'd be okay with it if it made her happy. I repeated, "I want you to be happy, with me, the way we used to be. Not with someone else." I couldn't comprehend how she thought I'd ever be on board with this, especially after I had been so clear about my stance on cheating. She tried to rationalize it, saying it wouldn't technically be infidelity because she would have my permission. Firmly, I cut her off, that's never going to happen. Looking back, I couldn't believe how I had let things get to this point. I admitted that maybe I should have seen the signs, should have realized how boredom and loneliness had pulled us apart. I confessed that Tom's attention had somehow reignited something in her, something I hadn't been able to do. When she questioned how I could feel bored and lonely when we were supposedly in love, I had to admit, I don't know. She didn't stop there, though. She suggested maybe it was because I had distanced myself first, stopped having lunch with her, stopped spending as much time together. She accused me of choosing to isolate myself, spending more time with work and friends, leaving both of us lonely and vulnerable. She refused to believe she had been the one to pull away. She reminded me of the times when I had said I was too busy for lunch, even texting her to go without me. In her eyes, I was the one who had changed, and she thought the fact that I never brought it up meant I didn't even realize how much had shifted between us. You were so wrapped up in your own world with Tom that you didn't even realize you were losing me, Kelly cried out, her voice shaking. She declared that she didn't want Tom, that she wanted me, and begged for us to go back to the way we used to be. Apologizing, she admitted she had messed up and that, in her frustration, she had given up on us. But I shook my head, telling her it was too late for that. Kelly pleaded, promising to quit her job, to find work somewhere else, and to never see Tom again. She swore, once again, that she loved me, insisting that she hadn't cheated because they hadn't slept together. She called herself a fool, saying Tom meant nothing to her, begging me not to leave. But I stood firm, telling her, it's not that simple. When she tried to argue that I had stopped her before anything went too far, I cut her off. Just because you didn't have sex doesn't mean you didn't betray me. Kelly protested, claiming that they were just friends. I fired back, you should have been closer friends with me than anyone else. Feeling overwhelmed, Kelly dropped her head into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably, vowing never to take me for granted again. She pleaded with me, asking if we could treat this as a huge mistake and begging for forgiveness. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. It wasn't just a mistake, I said firmly. It was a betrayal of everything we had. She tried to insist that her heart had always belonged to me, and that giving her body to another man was something she was willing to do just to save our relationship. I reminded her that she didn't go through with it, but I questioned whether my love for her was so meaningless that she thought it wasn't worth fighting for. Kelly tearfully claimed that I meant everything to her and that she'd do anything for me, even die for me. My love for you is gone, I told her coldly. Her eyes went wide, and she let out a scream, grabbing at my arms, begging me not to go. Even with her apologies and desperate pleas, I stood my ground. I believe you're sorry, I said, but that doesn't change the fact that I don't love you anymore. I told her she could find comfort with Tom now. When she revealed that Tom was married and only interested in a physical fling, I smirked and replied, well, I'm sure his wife will have something to say about that. I then informed Kelly that both Tom's wife and I had hired the same divorce attorney. I handed her a folder filled with the investigator's report, photos of her with Tom, and the details of the divorce settlement. Take your time and read it all, I advised. Kelly begged me not to go through with it, but I didn't say another word. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out of the house, not looking back as I heard her sobbing uncontrollably behind me. Update. Kelly struggled with the divorce proceedings, and rather than drag it out with an expensive legal fight, I agreed when the judge recommended we try marriage counseling. To my surprise, the counseling worked better than I ever expected. It gave us a space to communicate openly, without judgment. Kelly finally understood how Tom's advances had almost destroyed our marriage, and I was able to express the depth of the pain and humiliation she had caused. The counselor was proud of the progress we made. After a few sessions, I moved back home, and Kelly and I found ourselves reconnecting in ways we hadn't in years. We even rekindled our passion, and Kelly was more open to my desires than she had ever been. A year later, we were back to the love we had at the beginning of our marriage. Kelly had quit her old job and joined me at my company. We commuted together, had lunch together every day, not because we had to, but because we genuinely wanted to. We did almost everything together. We decorated a small Christmas tree, finished those old paintings we had started years ago, took another ceramics class, and even signed up for ballroom dancing lessons. To my surprise, I found an old box of coloring pens, and they weren't dried out after all. One night, as we cuddled under a blanket watching You've Got Mail, Kelly kissed me softly and said she needed to tell me something important. I saw tears welling up in her eyes, and for a moment, my heart skipped a beat in panic. Before I could even respond, Kelly blurted out, "You're going to be a daddy." I smiled, wiped away her tears, and playfully imitated Tom Hanks, saying, "Don't cry, shopgirl. I'm a sucker for happy endings." Alright, that wraps up that fun story. Now, let's move on to another thrilling one. Stay tuned, because this next one's going to take you for a ride. My name's Bob, and I'm a 48-year-old trucker. Once upon a time, I had a perfect marriage, or at least I thought I did. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything crumbled. I lost not only my family but also my job and the house I worked so hard to buy over a decade ago. Let me tell you how my wife's betrayal turned my life upside down. As a truck driver, the road became my second home. Hours spent behind the wheel blurred into one long stretch of asphalt. The scenery passed by like a distant memory, with new faces and places constantly coming and going. There were nights I'd sleep in the cab of my truck, wrapped up tight in a blanket to fight off the cold. Sometimes, traffic jams from accidents or construction held me up, but pulling into a motel for a hot shower and a Real bed offered some relief from the grind. Trucking's a job full of ups and downs. But it allowed me to provide for my wife, Melissa, and our daughter, Nancy. I did everything I could to be home as much as possible, but those long-haul trips meant missing out on important moments. Still, they always welcomed me back with open arms. Nancy would come running, shouting with excitement, and throw herself into my arms, telling me all about her days. Melissa would be there with a warm smile and a hot meal. Despite the distance my job created, our relationship felt stable enough, though it wasn't exactly joyful. I married Melissa when I found out she was pregnant unexpectedly. It didn't feel like I had much of a choice. She was in nursing school at the time and didn't want to drop out, so I took up trucking to support us and her education. The job kept me away from home, but I still cared for her deeply. And when Nancy was born, everything changed. My love for that little girl was something else. She brought light to my life on those long, lonely roads. Coming home wasn't just about relaxing, it was about seeing Nancy. She always greeted me first, and holding her in my arms after weeks away made everything worthwhile. We spent as much time together as we could, going to the zoo, riding carnival rides, playing games. I'd share stories about my trips, and she'd tell me all about her world. Even when I was on the road, she'd call me every night before bed. Knowing I was working hard for her made it easier to get through the tough days. Now, Nancy's 18 and starting college, but no matter how grown-up she seems, she'll always be my little girl. Even when I get home late, she's still there with a smile and a hug, just like when she was younger. Melissa, on the other hand, often isn't around due to her night shifts at the hospital. So, on nights when she doesn't expect me back, I slip in, take off my jacket and shoes, and head straight to the kitchen for something to eat. Nancy always warms up dinner for me, and we chat while the kettle boils. I told her all about my recent trip to Oregon, about the rugged cliffs, Crater Lake, Smith Rock State Park, the waterfalls, and Mount Hood. I shared my dream of taking the whole family out there for a vacation, to enjoy the beauty of nature together. Nancy didn't say much about the idea, which struck me as odd. So, I asked, "How've you and your mom been without me around?" with a grin, expecting her to say how much they missed me. But instead, tears welled up in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, instantly concerned. I've never been good with tears, especially not when it comes to my daughter. And then, without warning, she started sobbing, hugging me tight like she used to when she was a little girl, burying her face in my chest. "It's been rough here without you," Nancy whispers, her words catching me off guard. It turns out that while I've been out on the long, empty highways, my wife has been inviting a stranger into our home. The guy's name is Ian, and though he claims to be a coworker and just a friend, Nancy's unsettled by him. He acts inappropriately, walking around shirtless, putting his feet up on the couch like he owns the place, laughing obnoxiously, and telling crude jokes. He helps himself to whatever he wants, rummaging through my books, messing with tools in the garage, and digging through the kitchen cabinets like it's his own house. Nancy told me she's asked him to respect the place, but he just laughs it off, treating her concerns like they're a joke. His presence makes her feel unsafe in what should be her home, turning it into the domain of some unwanted guest who acts like the king of the castle whenever he shows up. Nancy's been locking herself in her room to escape him, but his loud voice and conversations with her mom still reach her ears. It bothers her deeply, her mom's sudden disregard for the home we once kept so neat, cozy, and peaceful. Things got worse when Nancy revealed that this guy has been barging into her room unannounced, going through her stuff, and asking her personal questions. He even made inappropriate comments about her appearance. Nancy tried to talk to her mom about it, asking her to stop letting him come over, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Ever since Ian showed up, her mom's been all about him, neglecting Nancy entirely. As Nancy tells me all of this, my mind races, imagining my return and how I'm going to restore order in my home. There's no way I'm letting some guy behave like that under my roof. The thought of Melissa cheating on me with this stranger sends a shockwave of anger through me. I'm tempted to let my rage out, break something, hit something, but the fear in Nancy's eyes holds me back. Instead, I decide to take a different approach. I'll catch my wife in the act and confront this guy face to face. I send Melissa a message, pretending I'm delayed on the road, and book a motel room just a block away. The plan's simple: if the guy comes back, Nancy will call, and I'll rush in. I didn't have to wait long. Just 2 days later, Nancy called me, and I hurried back home. My hands were trembling with tension and adrenaline as I slipped quietly through the back door, heading straight for the bedroom where I could hear voices and laughter. The moment felt like it stretched forever, but then I slammed the door open, making it crash against the wall. There they were, my wife and the lover, locked in a kiss that abruptly ended the moment I burst in. There was no mistaking it now. Melissa's affair was right in front of me. She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe I was standing there. The guy, dressed in just his pants, had the nerve to glare at me, demanding, "Who the hell are you?" as if I was the one intruding in my own home. I responded with my fist, landing it square on his face. Everything that happened next was a blur of rage. I threw punch after punch, hitting him in the face, ribs, and gut until he crumpled to the floor, knocked out cold. Breathing heavily, I turned to face Melissa, whose expression was frozen in a mix of shock and horror. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice laced with bitterness. Tears welled up in my eyes, a wave of betrayal and loneliness crashing over me. As the initial shock faded, Melissa grabbed the phone and called for an ambulance. The minutes of waiting stretched on forever until the sirens finally broke the silence. Paramedics rushed in, taking the unconscious man out on a stretcher. Melissa and I followed them to the hospital, sitting awkwardly in the waiting room, the tension between us palpable. Sitting there in silence, I kept replaying the night over and over in my head. What had finally pushed me to confront my wife? We had a long talk that night. She admitted that she'd felt unloved for a long time, said my constant absences for work, combined with my focus on our daughter, had left her feeling neglected. She even confessed to being jealous of the bond one shared with Nancy. She craved affection, and even though we lived under the same roof, our schedules kept us apart. She felt lonely, and Ian had given her a temporary escape from that solitude, offering companionship in the empty spaces of her life. Thankfully, his injuries weren't too serious, just a concussion, according to the doctors. After that night, Melissa and I made the decision to go our separate ways. Our marriage, which had been more of a commitment out of necessity than genuine love, had been crumbling for a while. We began the divorce process and split everything down the middle. For me, it was a hard pill to swallow. After all the years I had put into our marriage, it never turned into the happy life I had once hoped for. Letting go of something that had brought so much pain was tough, but I knew I had to move on, for Nancy's sake, if nothing else. Melissa moved to another city, starting over with a clean slate. Eventually, she found love again and remarried. Forgiving her wasn't easy, but for the sake of our daughter, I kept things civil between us. Nancy would visit her mom from time to time, but she never felt like she belonged in her mother's new family. Her real home was with me, where she knew she was truly loved. Through all the challenges life threw our way, Nancy and I became closer than ever, and we found real happiness in each other's company.